In Chapter 4, we're going to look at supply and demand and kind of relate it to the labor and financial markets, where we can see how supply and demand affects labor, the amount of people that we employ, and also the financial markets and interest rates and the amount of loans that are given out. Most of the time when we think about demand and supply, we think about it in relation to goods being produced. But labor markets, service the industry, nursing profession, they can also be affected by supply and demand, and they are affected by supply and demand. And we're going to look at a couple examples of how supply and demand affects the nursing profession. We can see by this graph that there's an equilibrium point. Equilibrium point is $70,000. Here we're looking at the demand as the demand for nurses in the field. We're looking at supply as the supply of nurses that are trained and willing to work in the field. We come together with an equilibrium of $70,000 and approximately 35,000 nurses that would be employed at that equilibrium where we would clear the market. Anyone who wanted a job as a nurse would have a job as a nurse at $70,000. If that wage was to go up to $75,000, we can see by the graph that the demand for those nurses would be less. Our demand for the nurses would go down to 33,000, and the supply would increase to 38,000. So there we would have an excess quantity of nurses that are willing to be supplied as nurses. We would have more or less an unemployment of nurses. We say that below that equilibrium point, there's going to be less demand. There's going to be more demand. The demand is going to be greater than the supply. The demand in that particular case is going to go up to 40,000 because the wages are lower. They have to pay less wages. The people that want to work at that amount is going to be less. So we're going to have a shortage. We're going to have a shortage of nurses. And we can apply this to any employment situation. At that equilibrium wage, everyone who is ready and willing to work at that wage will work. Above that wage, we're not going to have as many jobs, so there'll be less people working. Below that wage, we're not going to have as many in demand, so there'll be less people wanting to work. Here's an example of two graphs that show what can happen with technology changes in the employment world. If the technology increases, low-skilled labor is going to decrease. The demand for low-skilled labor is going to decrease because a lot of those low-skilled jobs are going to be replaced by technology. So the low-skilled laborers, we're going to have less jobs for them. There's going to be a shift in the demand for low-skilled workers. So the wages will go down and the quantity demanded is going to go down. On the other hand, the technology changes are going to produce more jobs for high-skilled labor. People who have that technology information, that skills to operate the new technology, we're going to have a positive shift in that. So the wage is going to increase, plus the quantity demanded is going to increase for those types of jobs, those high-skill labor jobs. Here we're showing an example of what could happen with the price floor. With labor, we're talking about wages per hour, so this could be related to a minimum wage situation. If the government was to impose a minimum wage, we can see that our equilibrium wage is $10 an hour. $10 an hour, we have a labor force of 1,200 people. 1,200 people would be working. 1,200 people would want to work. The demand for those 1,200 people are there, and the supply of those 1,200 people are there at that $10 an hour wage. But if we put a wage floor on it, or a price floor, wage floor, same thing. If we put a wage floor on it of $12 an hour, in other words, we had a minimum wage of $12 an hour, we see that the amount supplied, the people who want to work, is going to be greater. We're going to actually have 1,600 workers who want to work because the wage is greater. But the demand for those workers is going to be less. The demand is only going to be 700 workers. So the employers are only going to want to hire 700 workers because they don't have enough wages to pay the $12 an hour to that many workers. So actually, when we have a wage floor that's above the equilibrium point, if we talk about a minimum wage that's above the equilibrium hourly wage, we're going to create unemployment. Mostly your lower skilled workers, teenage workers, and things like that will suffer from this. But the increase in the minimum wage actually causes an unemployment situation. Here we're showing how supply and demand affects the financial markets. We can see here that we have demand and supply for capital expenditures, where that demand is people wanting to borrow money for financial capital. Supply is financial institutions who want to lend money to those borrowers. We have an equilibrium at that 15%. We can see where that anything that is ready to be loaned out would be borrowed at that 15% interest rate. That's the market clearing rate. So 15% would be the ideal interest rate for this particular economy. We can see that if we get above that 15% rate, this example shows here 21%, the amount supplied is going to be increased. The banks are going to want, the financial institutions and banks are going to want to loan out more money. They have that financial capital available, but because the interest rate is higher, there's going to be less demand, so there's going to be a surplus of funds. The banks and financial institutions are going to have a surplus, and what happens when they have a surplus? If they want to loan out that money, they're going to lower those interest rates and go back down, have that natural pull back down to that equilibrium point. We can also see that if we get down below that equilibrium interest rate at 13%, we're going to have a shortage of funds. There's going to be more demand than supply. There's going to be more people demanding those funds. There's going to be competition for those funds. So eventually the financial institutions will have that natural pull to go back up to that equilibrium rate. So supply and demand will affect just about any market that you can think of. This graph shows the supply and demand of financial capital, supply that comes in from the foreign sectors to help us finance our government. And this is before the uncertainty of our U.S. public debt, before the debt ceiling was raised, and there was controversy whether we would be paying our bills or not. And this is the rate of return. We can see that rate of return is in equilibrium. And that rate of return is going to be based on what these foreign sectors need in order to invest in a opportunity. When they invest in the United States, they want a certain rate of return, and that's what this is based on. This graph is that same financial market, that same foreign sector investing into the United States. The previous graph was when we had a good standing and there was no uncertainty. Once that uncertainty increased, the foreign governments want a larger return. They want more return on their investment. So we have a supply shift. The demand is still there, but we have to pay more interest in order to get those loans. So that demand shifts, or that supply shifts. We see that interest rate increases, but the demand slows down. We have less quantity that we're actually borrowing. Most states have a cap on the amount of interest that can be charged by credit card companies. They have a price ceiling. In other words, a credit card company can only charge so much interest. By doing that, we're creating we're going to have more demand for credit on credit cards than we have supply. The suppliers of the credit cards are not going to want to establish as much credit. They're not going to want to give out as much credit because that interest rate is less than that equilibrium point. Since we have that price ceiling is set by the government, then that can't be raised. We can't have that natural pull back to that equilibrium point. We can't. The credit card companies cannot, by law, raise their interest rates. Some credit card companies make it up in membership fees and annual fees. So basically, when we look at a supply and demand chart, we're looking at relationships. We're looking at what could happen. We're looking at how to explain what happened with economic events. We can see that when prices go up, if they're above that equilibrium point, we're going to have a surplus, and eventually prices will have to come back down in order to get rid of that surplus. We know that if prices go down and we have a greater demand and we have a supply, we know eventually prices are going to go back up to meet that demand. So when we look at a supply and demand chart, no matter what it's from, what those the X and Y axis are showing. And normally I would say that the Y axis is usually dealing with price. The X axis is usually dealing with some type of quantity. But we can look at those relationships, and we can explain those relationships a little easier. Getting back to the supply and demand with the nurses, we can see that in the past few years, we've had a greater, past 10 or 15 years, we've had a greater demand for nurses. That's because people are living longer, people are needing more health care. The demand for nurses has greatly increased. So we've had a shift in demand because that the quantity, the population has changed. The population has changed where we need more people in the nursing field. So we've had a positive shift in demand, and we see that the original equilibrium price, the equilibrium salary for nurses has increased because of that. We need more nurses. We have to have a more demand for nurses, so that equilibrium wage has increased substantially because of that. The other thing that's happened with the nursing profession is that demand has increased. We've had that positive shift in demand, and we can see that what that caused. We went from the EO to the E1. We had that shift there in demand, but also the supply of nurses have decreased. We know that there's fewer nurses graduating. One of those problems is there's not enough people in nursing education to satisfy the people who want to get into nursing. So there's fewer nurses graduating from school that are ready to go into nursing. So the supply has actually decreased in the amount of nurses. We've had a lot of nurses that are retiring, people that have been in the field for a long time, retiring, getting out of the field. So it's creating a decrease in supply. We've had a shift in supply because we have fewer people coming into the nursing field, and then we have people going out of the nursing field. So what's that done is we had a negative shift in supply. We can see what that's done to the nurses' salaries. It's taking that salary up even more. We went from the equilibrium point of E0 up to E1 with the demand shift. Now with the supply, the negative supply shift, we're taking that nurse's salary up even more. So nurses are getting paid quite a bit more than what their original equilibrium was. Now that could change if the nursing industry changes and more people get into nursing, which most nursing classes are fairly full. We may have that positive shift in the supply, where we have more supply. We may shift back to that E1 or somewhere in that vicinity. But you can see how supply and demand, you can put this with any field, with any objects, just see how they relate to each other, what would happen in scenarios. And that's kind of what we do in economics. We use these graphs to explain phenomenon that happens in the economic world.